Hello and welcome to the Software Engineering Unlocked podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michaela, and today I have the pleasure to talk to Dr. Kat Hicks. Kat, or Catherine Hicks, holds a PhD in experimental psychology and is a principal researcher and team lead at Catharsis Consulting. She has designed research at places like Google, Khan Academy, and co-founded a startup that builds tools for software engineers. And she led multi-institutional collaborations in online learning. So, well, I'm super thrilled to have Kat here with me. Kat, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, me too. I'm following you for a long time now on Twitter, and I was very impressed because you have a similar, not the same, obviously very different, but you have a similar background, like coming from academia and then going independent, and so
Yeah.
so it was very interesting to see how you built Catharsis Consulting, and you're the founder of Catharsis Consulting, right?
That's
So
correct.
how do you help people with empirical research? I'm also an empirical researcher, really in the software engineering area, and you are now empirical researcher coming from experimental psychology. How do you help companies?
That's right. That's right. So it's delightful to connect. I think there are a growing cohort of us out there, in the world who have made this journey. And there's not really a roadmap for us. So I love to talk about it. I like to call Catharsis an evidence science consultancy. So this means that we help partners use evidence to inform their decision making and tell their stories. And in particular, we're very focused on meaningful measurement. So I describe it to people as not just data for the sake of data, but creating research methods that give us data that's fit for purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So I try to help partners who are trying to learn something real about the world they're working in and how to move forward. And we have a couple areas of competency and special focus. But we've led projects. It's easier to give examples, right,
Mm-hmm.
than talk high level. So some recent projects are I've asked things like, how can we find evidence that a product design change in a language learning game actually increased the learning that was happening for children using the game? Another recent project is using surveys to help a small nonprofit tell the stories of how community members that they worked with were helping people in their own families and in their social networks learn about the COVID vaccine and make the decision to try to get that vaccine. So both of those projects, very different scale for those projects, very different types of data, but both of those projects connected to really immediate impact, whether it was on product design or on an intervention and programming that help doctors have better communication with their patients. So at Catharsis, we try to bring a few core principles to all of our research projects. One of them is just that people deserve to understand their data and to really use the data that they already have maybe special access to, and to try to bring the tools of empirical research to everyone, even small organizations that may not have invested in learning those skills before. So one thing that we bring in a lot of our partnerships is an emphasis on teaching those research methods and taking it not just from, findings on one project right now, but actually fitting any work that you do with data into a larger plan of moving forward.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting, and it reminds me. I'm more on the training side, right? So I'm helping a lot of
Mhm.
software engineers actually get better at code reviews, but all of that also based on empirical research that I did around code reviews. But recently, this year, actually half of the year, I spent on a research project with a startup and helped them
Mm.
come up with a framework on what makes developer experience really great, and they created a product out of that. So I can totally relate to that, and it was really a
Mm.
wonderful experience. But this experimental nature of research and startup, somehow there was also a lot of tension, I would say, right? There was a lot of tension of,
Yeah.
it's very different than in an academic world. You have like these questions, and here was every day there was the question, is this impactful? Is this impactful, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if you experienced that as well, and how do you handle that
Oh
in
my
your
gosh.
work?
I think we all experience right? There's a tension between things that you're doing for the long term and needs that are in the short term. And then, just to be really real about it, I think there's a lot of people who have agendas about what we're going to find.
Yeah,
And
exactly,
if
right?
yeah, and I try very hard to always work with partners who have told me, we are going to make changes based on what we find, even if the changes are uncomfortable to us, or even if we learned something that conflicts what we thought before.
Hmm.
This is very important for social impact work. It's very important for equity when you're going to do anything that has to do with people's well-being. But it is a core tension, and I think that researchers, we tend to be people who love the truth, right? And we're just all about finding out the truth, and that can ruffle feathers. I love to do exactly what you described, where you go from working closely with people who are living an experience and then translate that, to leaders and to organizational structures. And I think it's a beautiful role to be in, but it requires a lot of invisible work, right? Of explaining both sides to each other.
Yeah, yeah, and working with this tension, right? Which I think
Hmm.
is so for me it was a very challenging time, a time that I learned a lot,
Mm.
because for me the rigor of the methodology is the most important thing, right? And and then comes time for the startup. It's more the time, and then the rigor. I think, right? Like
Yeah,
obviously, like at least a little bit. There is the priority, or they are more stressed by the timing than than a researcher probably is,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so on. And so you have to deal with these tensions, and I think it was a very, very interesting learning experience for me. But what I really loved is that I could see this research transformed into a product, and
Mm.
this was actually the reason also why I left a little bit academia, because I was missing that. This
Yeah,
getting real, right? So I created a lot of prototypes in my research career, and I actually think some of them maybe would even have had some potential, even for open source, right? Maybe not making tons of money, but some
hmm,
open source software that people would have used. But there was never the time. Again, we are coming back to time, but in a different way, right? So the time was up after the paper is published. The time was up to work on that. And so
yeah,
I felt like I couldn't really translate it into what I would like to see, right? And this is why
yeah.
I left, for example, academia. Oh, how is that for you? Why did you leave this traditional, path of a researcher, and start your own consultancy
Yeah.
company, and do your own thing, go independent, right?
Yeah, for sure. So, I think that it's interesting because I'm a researcher who likes to study environments. So, whenever you ask someone about their choice as an individual, I think you have to see it also as a choice about what was around them.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, I'll be real about that. I mean, academia is very hard to succeed in, not because of the quality of your work, but because of the opportunities that are around. But I think that there was a really core piece of what I loved. So I started out working in classrooms. I started working, asking about the beginning of how we learn to learn. And even in my academic work, I was very interested in being in real schools, talking to real children, was where I started. I did a dissertation with 3 to 11-year-olds. So you can
Oh
imagine,
yeah,
uh, yeah, asking young children about how they were thinking about mistakes and how they were thinking about learning. So from
that
the
must be
very
so
beginning,
cool.
it's amazing how much it pays off, right?
Yeah.
Because we all start there, and even now I work with adults, and yet all of the same questions come up all the time. So, I think
Yeah.
from the beginning, I found it beautiful and amazing that people are constantly scanning around them, asking whether it's okay to make mistakes and asking who they can talk to. And I just, I saw a lot of exciting stuff out there in tech. I think the journey for me too, there's a personal, that's kind of the problem space. But being an entrepreneur is also a way for me to carve out this role that I did not see existing. So I always felt a little bit like I'm a social scientist and a data scientist. I'm a data scientist who cares, about how we measure things. I like meaningful data more than big data. It felt like with Catharsis, it was a way to make the job that I wanted to have, to do
Yeah.
these kinds of projects.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
exactly what I did as well.
Mhm. I love
create
that.
create the job that I would like to do and that I feel like I can strive at. Um,
Yeah, and it takes
yeah,
courage. You have to
yeah.
you have to say I know this is valuable, which I think you do as a researcher, just like you were talking about with that startup.
Hmm.
Sometimes you have to be the person who's saying, I know that this will pay off if you will do it.
Yeah,
You haven't measured it, so you can't see it yet, but I know it will because I've been there working with people and I see their pain and frustration and whatever else. And then they build it into a product, right? And it does pay off.
yeah, exactly, right? Yeah, so I looked at your newest report, which was super
Mm,
interesting for me because it is around the software engineering teams. And there you shed light on the learning debt that we
mhm.
have and how that can affect engineering teams. Can you tell us a little bit more about what this report is about, what this software or what this research actually investigated or looked at, and what is learning that, and why do we have it as
Yeah.
software engineers?
Yeah, great question. So, as a part of Catharsis's work, I can occasionally invest in this sort of work, basically for the field. So, this is a report I did because I found it really interesting and shared publicly, and it's called "Coding in the Dark."
Hmm.
I interviewed 25 software engineers or developers, and I asked them to share about their active problem solving as they were ramping up on an unfamiliar code base. So this was people talking about their real jobs right now. They shared about code review, they shared about how they asked for help, how they collaborated, and I've shared a lot about, what we talked about. Um, and essentially, what I found was even at these really big tech companies, most of the people were talking to were all at big tech companies. Um, Even at these places, people's experiences were really quite frustrating. So I called this report "Coding in the Dark" because that was a quote from one of the people I interviewed describing how they felt every day, like they were showing up and the lights were all off, and that they were having to fumble their way through learning without any help from anybody. And there was this core tension that they experienced between feeling like it was so important to learn, to build their understanding, to experiment, to iterate. But then when they showed up, to code review and to other moments where they were being evaluated, that learning was not being valued. So I described this cycle, of needing to do this work and then finding it devalued and going back to your kind of heads down at your desk, I describe that as learning debt. And learning debt is essentially the dynamic that happens when people know they need to put a lot of effort into learning and they know that the kind of work they need to do requires these mistakes and it requires this long term understanding. And there's kind of all of this stuff that you're doing that's sort of invisible because it's not showing up in your productivity. And they also know that the environment around them is only measuring that short term productivity. So, in this kind of environment where there's a lot of learning debt accumulating, essentially, learning you have to do that you're not getting rewarded for, there's also a lot of performance pressure. And what's worse, things like documentation, writing code comments, trying to help other people, you can actually feel actively punished for doing that.
Hmm.
Another quote in the one of the interviews I led was that learning would be seen as a waste of time. And I think one of the engineers called documentation and code comments a red flag about your abilities as an engineer. So you can imagine how that feels. You're in an environment that's telling you to do all this complex work, but also telling you that it's a waste of time if you help anybody else learn from what you've learned. So, a big conclusion that I have in this report is this debt cycle, this learning debt cycle can accumulate damage for a long time because teams might look very productive on the surface, but you're building what's really an inefficient experience for learning. So
Hmm.
I'll stop there and kind of let you
Yeah.
ask more.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I have tons of questions for that. And the first one
Yeah.
is really, what kind of persona did you interview? You were saying
Yeah.
people that are new to a code base, but is this, are you, did you ask them when they were onboarding? And is that the onboarding experience for people?
Yeah.
Or is that
Yeah. So
somebody that's already on a team but with a new problem? It sounds more like
yeah.
an
So it was
onboarding experience, an unhappy onboarding experience, but
Yeah, it was a mix. It was a mix. So I think that one thing that's interesting is that you might think, oh, this is somebody who's just new to a whole
hmm.
company, they're experiencing but actually I found this was a repeating cycle. So some people were fairly junior. You'll see there's a cross section of seniority. So we
Hmm.
really wanted, it is a qualitative project. So it's not intended to be a representative sample. I think,
Hmm.
follow up surveys on this kind of thing would be really, really fun to work on. But in this cross section, we did have a good number of junior folks, but also senior folks, even a couple people who were leading the engineering teams at their organization. I did ask them to bring in and think about before the interviews when they were a recent problem they had of basically trying to understand someone else's code. So this, for some people, this was a really brand new code base, right? Like the whole thing as they were joining a company. But for some people, it was just a piece that they hadn't really touched before. So yeah, it was happening really all over the place,
Yeah.
right?
And so the other
Yeah.
question that I had when I tried to envision this is what kind of learning, because there are many things that
Hmm.
are, that we can learn as software engineers. And I feel that everything that has to do with technology
Hmm.
is rewarded and is seen as something, that you get some credit for at least. And that it's also very
Hmm.
internally, a lot of engineers like to learn new technology. But then if we are coming to code bases, domain knowledge, right? All the work that you have to do to understand this piece of code for a
Hmm.
code review and so on, right? I think I
Yeah.
can maybe relate more that this is the kind of learning where I would see this. You're supposed to already know it, right? So let's skip that step. You know it, and then you do your productive work. And why do you,
Yeah.
this is somehow the
Yeah.
invisible thing. Is that is my just guess here, is it going in the right
Yeah.
direction, or what kind of learning did you investigate
Yeah.
here?
Absolutely. And I love that you have called out the complexity of learning. It's learning is a big word for a lot of different
Hmm.
things, right? And of course, you've had some really phenomenal thinkers who have broke on this podcast that I've really enjoyed, who've talked about, productivity is not one thing, satisfaction is not one
Hmm.
thing. The same could be said for learning. So, I thought a useful contribution in this report would be to talk very broadly about the beliefs we have about learning, but the actual specific examples are a lot of different things. And I think it does map on, right, to exactly what you said. So developers feel like, oh, if I'm learning a new language or a new piece of, a new tool, something that's very explicit, right? That's easier to defend and it's easier to justify. But the focus is always on the technology, right? And the
Hmm.
production, and not so much on, oh, now I really understand how this other team has a mental model of, this connection piece, or I really understand this dependency that happens and I understand these trade-offs. So, there's actually a tremendous amount of content I got in these interviews that's not even in the report because it was so much. I think it could be another report on the kind of active learning that they were doing. And a lot of it felt, almost secretive. Like people were saying, oh, I'm sure no one else has to do this like I do, has to go back and remind themselves, because, and I don't want to talk about it because I'm afraid I won't look like an engineer. But the reality was, to me, a lot of that stuff, like thinking about the trade offs of different decisions you made, thinking about whether a design decision, that we put on paper really was that way in the code, and even questions that are kind of like, is it worth the investment to fix this inefficient piece when I could instead be working on this other piece? These are very abstract things for people to be thinking and learning about, but they're really, really critical. And I was reminded too, there's a lot of myths around learning, right? And as a social scientist, I recognize some of these myths. So people will tend to think once I learn something, it's just learned forever, right? It just goes into like my brain is a bucket and I just dump something in there and it's always going to be there. But actually, learning is really a behavior over time. So the more an environment cannot see it as shameful, but see it as beautiful and productive and great, that sometimes we're asking each other for help. We're reminding ourselves how things work, and you see that when developers talk about Googling for answers, right? And asking on Stack Overflow and all of these other kinds of things that people do. But it was interesting to me how much they hid that stuff
Yeah.
from their environment. Yeah.
Yeah, because the real engineer knows all the keyboard shortcuts, like
Right.
otherwise
There
you're
is
not
no
the
real.
real engineer, right? And yeah,
Exactly.
and I think it's so true what you say, right? So learning, what is learning? And if we are making a
Hmm.
decision around trade-offs,
Hmm.
think very often it's not framed as learning. And then it's
Hmm.
also how if I can't write it down, and if it's not in a book, if it's a very specific instance of something, and not
Hmm.
a general thing that I can learn, um, what does this even mean, right? So we learn, for example, about object orientation, and how to have objects, but then to really think about this piece here and the instance of, should I create an object here, and how should the object look like, and that I have to think about that is a little bit shameful, because obviously I learned object oriented programming, and so it should be easily coming to me, what methods I should put in here, or naming, right? Naming a method. um, it's
Yeah.
also learning somehow, or we have to put the time into, and then it's hard. And even though we make jokes about it, if somebody sits next to you and you have to think about a good name and only stupid names come to your mind, it's horrible, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you're pointing out something that's actually really really important here, which is, there are good jokes and bad jokes, right?
Hmm.
And we've been around, we've all probably been around someone who has made a joke, that has made us feel really bad about how we learn or a mistake that we made. And this is something that came up in the report too, that, I think one of the quotes was, I'm always watching, like from a junior code writer, someone said, I'm always watching the senior members of my team because I want to know what an engineer is supposed to sound like. And that can be really, really beneficial if the people around you are saying things like, we all make mistakes, we all forget something, we all help each other. That's a good learning culture. But a negative learning culture, right? A bad culture is a place where people are saying, oh, don't waste your time like doing this documentation, like in order to get ahead, what you actually need to make sure you're doing is putting on this performance. Things are very multifaceted, as all of these things are always happening at once. But
Yeah.
I do think that there's, in engineering culture, there's a lot of myths around what brilliance looks like. And this is where I've pulled from some research from people like Andre Simpian, who's done some work on, when a field thinks that you don't make mistakes, you have to just be born brilliant, then that is a story that is not how it works, right? But we're all kind of upholding that myth.
Yeah, because we all want to be the 10x engineer, right?
Hmm.
And then we are the half X engineer. Like, oh my
Yeah.
God. No, but
And something
yeah.
no something that, just hurts my heart, honestly, is like the people do this work, right? People do mentor other people, they do support learning, and that actually is what creates 10x results. I mean, investing in learning is one of the most evidence-backed ways that we have to do work together. And I
Yeah.
think if we could see it as something that we are sharing and that we're all working on outside of ourselves, it's never about, you write bad code, I write bad code, all right, fine, like we work to make the code better. It's outside of us, and it does not tell me who you are as an engineer. In fact, a good engineer is someone who's written a lot of bad code.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I
Yeah.
mean, we need to improve things and give feedback, right? But I think we need to value the messages that feedback sends.
Yeah. I think that I want to come back to this different kinds of things that we learn, and
Mm,
writing good code, whatever that means. And it's also, I think,
hmm.
changing over time. What is good code, right?
Yeah.
What is a good way to write code? What are good applications? How to structure them? That also evolves.
Hmm.
But again, I would say this is this textbook knowledge, right? And then I think
Hmm.
what's and this comes back to code reviews and to the day-to-day work that we have to do, and to productivity a lot as well, is
Hmm.
this constant learning, right? I cannot stop learning. I
Yeah.
cannot, it's not like, oh, now I work, obviously, you get better at this code base and more familiar with the terminology and with how your team works and so on, yes.
Right.
But still, even if I'm at this team for 3 years and have worked with this code base for X years, right? If I have a new change that somebody else wrote, then I have to look at this
Hmm.
cose. Learning
Yeah.
starts right there, and
Yeah.
and I cannot come in and have this full bucket of knowledge of how that works, and then supposed to already point out what's going wrong here. And I think this is and maybe it has to do with how we measure time, and a lot of people, I think, have really problems with time. I have a lot of problems with
Mm,
time, like
mm.
when should I leave the house to be on the time, right? And I think
Hmm.
very similar, we estimate, for example, how long will it take to look at this code and give comments. And very often
Yeah.
people reduce that to the time to make the comments, but this learning part that is never stopping, continues, and will
Yeah.
happen, and that nobody wants to talk about, and nobody actually wants to have, and nobody has time for it. That somehow gets forgotten, or is forgotten, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I agree. I agree. And time came up a lot in these interviews, and it doesn't surprise me because, we all have felt this time pressure. And what I kept asking was, if you're experiencing this time pressure, like what is the first thing that gets cut is honestly to me some of the most valuable stuff. And that is really hard for people. So, you know, there is a sense in which I think I totally agree that doing this work, the learning will never stop. And it can feel a little overwhelming. But
Hmm.
I think that that's a reason to say, um, what success is not you getting to the end of your learning. Like that's not what success is. Success is having enough space to make a good decision instead of a bad decision about
Hmm.
how we move forward. And I did see people go through that. And actually, you know, I agree that it's very difficult sometimes with this work to predict how much time it's going to take. And I experienced that with my own work. People ask you to do a research project and you say, okay, like it all sounds good, but I need to get in there and see what the truth is. And we might learn it's way more complicated. So I think about things like, can we have measurement of productivity that is dynamic that we're able to come back to and change it? And I think people will get very, very frustrated, when they are assigned a project, they dive into it, they do all this learning. Actually mapping out how complicated it is a very valuable piece of learning that they've done. And they turn around and they want to share that with somebody, and there's no way to share that. There's no way to kind of get credit for it.
Hmm.
So that's one thing I think about is if we can make some of that more visible, right? Like allow you to use the learning and share it with collaborators. I think that people really enjoy that. They feel the productivity of it, even if your goals of the project change. Another thing is, can we talk about where time pressure makes sense and where it doesn't make sense, right? So can we
Yeah.
prioritize and see the cost of putting everyone under a time crunch all the time, and where that is just creating these learning debt cycles?
Yeah. So, Kat,
Yeah.
what I want to understand a little bit more is
Mm,
there were definitely some outcomes from this report that tell us how can we
yeah.
improve, right? How can we
Yeah.
reduce this learning debt? How can we have this growth mindset? How can we, how can we, in our, at least in our engineering team, celebrate learning and make it a bigger priority? What are some of those outcomes? What can you suggest to
Yeah.
engineering teams that want to improve their learning experience and the
For
valuing of
sure.
that?
I think there's a piece of this puzzle for every different role, right? So, from leaders, from engineering leaders and people who really these people can have a really outsized impact on the culture. And I think that you know, a lot of places will put a poster on the wall that says everyone can learn, or maybe there's a bullet point in a slideshow about like we're a learning culture. But if you go to work and you see someone actually get rewarded for a complicated learning situation, like, hey, we told you to go try to do this thing in the code base, it turned out the thing that we proposed was not possible to do, but you did all this learning, you figured out a better way forward. We're going to celebrate that instead of, coming down on somebody for it being not what we expected. Those kinds of moments, and I think leaders have the ability, to notice that, to try to push themselves to amplify that. That can have an impact. Another thing I would suggest, that I suggest in the report is we honestly need to separate some of our development feedback from some of our performance feedback.
Okay.
So I don't know how many conversations you've had with engineering friends about perf cycles, but perf cycles are a huge source of stress. And even though we have invested, this is a whole area of research, there's a ton of people, who look at this.
Mm-hmm.
But even though we have invested huge structures into it in tech companies, a thing that I keep seeing as a learning scientist is that we are rarely letting people have psychological safety to talk about them learning. So I think that a very simple step that leaders could take is to make space to separate when you're talking about how you want to learn and grow and develop and maybe explore areas of growth for you, and separate that from promotion, performance, reputation management, times that you are trying to defend yourself, which is very difficult. You can't really do those two things at the same time. And I have a number of other recommendations in the report. I think that there are some simple steps like, have we put any time in our calendar for documentation, or are we just acting like that's going to happen magically by itself? So there are small and big steps to try to make yourself a learning culture. Does that all make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. And I think documentation again is maybe it's the
Hmm.
last thing that I want to talk a little bit about, because I think there again we have these two different kind of learnings of information of sharing. So you have this
Yeah.
external documentation of how does this
Yeah.
work, right? And people agree that an API needs documentation, but then the
Yep.
nitty gritty part becomes a little bit translucent, right? It's like, oh,
Yeah.
this method actually you should be able to understand it just by looking at the code, otherwise the code is not good. And don't put a comment there, that's really bad, right? And
Yep.
I sometimes I really can't understand the problem here, because well, it's great if and there are different learning types, and and different people, that maybe somebody is easier, it's easier for them to look at the code and really get it, then skip the comment, right? And some people like the comment and it gives them context, and you can read it
Mm,
in native, in your native language, or in
yeah.
in written language instead of code. But again, here there comes this the myth a little bit as well, where we say, well, code shouldn't actually be documented, right? And you
Yeah.
shouldn't need documentation to read this. And there is also some research around that, and they show that if there is, if there are comments in the code, people
Hmm.
are slower with reading the
Yep.
code. But why are they slower?
And here's time pressure again.
Because they are reading the comments, right? And would they read the
Right.
comments if the comments are useless? No, they are reading the comments because they're actually helpful, right? The
And
problem
that's such a good
becomes,
example.
yeah,
Yeah. That's such a good example of a measure that
yeah,
like is taken to be a negative measure, but why it might actually be a positive measure,
yeah,
right?
exactly,
Maybe.
right? Yeah,
Yeah, I think you bring so much rich lived experience on this, and I love hearing it because it's the reality is that these are going to be contextual decisions. Like a code that was, as you said, code that was good code, quote unquote, in one time might, if the context has changed, and then you need to make a different decision. And I think that there's there were these interesting quotes, when I interviewed people about who is this for? Is the documentation actually for me, or is it for, like some idealized scenario where we're describing the technology? And a point of view that I have in my consulting, is that I like to focus on people as the heart, and that code writers as learners, like if we take this approach where we center their learning, we can be a lot less afraid of things like sometimes the trade-off is that you have more comments and that doesn't work for all situations, but you have prevented some really deep losses in efficiency and invisible losses that are happening. So if someone's able to ramp up a lot more quickly, that's a huge gain. And I think something difficult about it is that sometimes that gain is really invisible. But it's not really possible to have a single way of describing code that's going to work for everyone who's ever learning it.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
similar to measuring developer productivity, I think it's a question of what is the best thing for us right now and what's going to pay off the most. Even if it slows us down a little bit in this way, then I think it will really pay off if later this person who we gave all this support to is able to become this champion contributor. And I just think, I use the learning debt cycle, like the learning debt metaphor, to evoke tech debt, because we understand tech debt, right, in this field. And we understand that technologies with all these dependencies can start to break apart, even if it made sense when we built it. And
Hmm.
I think the same is true for collaboration. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There's so much goodness in that, and I really
Mm.
want to dig into the productivity. So maybe what I'm going to
Yeah.
do is I'm going to invite you again, and we have
Oh,
a
lovely.
whole episode just on productivity if you're up for it.
I would
And
love it.
yeah, and then
Yeah.
we can really dissect that, because I would love to hear your opinion also on, you mentioned or hinted a little bit towards that can we measure learning as part of our
Yeah.
productivity, right? And I had a
Yep.
podcast where it was just me talking about productivity, and there I was asking the question, or I was saying that all these productivity measure that we have are focused around activity, right? Coming from an area of
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
industrial age, right? Where it was the activity that,
More is better.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And it was the activity that we did, right? You had only to do very mechanical tasks and the small task, and so you could count them, and so on, and all those measurements actually stem from there. And now we put them on knowledge workers, where probably the
Hmm.
most productive thing is that I'm sitting here doing nothing, but I make a really good trade-off decision, right?
That's right. That's right. Or
Right.
you help someone else and
Yeah.
later they do something. I would love to have that conversation. And I do think there are ways we can measure learning.
Hmm.
And, if anyone is going to be listening to this, like go to your team right now and ask, what are the things that we do that really make a difference, that are not being captured anywhere, that are not being rewarded? Like, what is the stuff that is important to do to keep this all of this running? And they will tell you. So,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know,
And coming back to what you say with sharing, I think what I have seen work really well is small things like brown
yeah,
bags, right? Where we come together
that's
and
right.
somebody just explains what they have learned this week. Or if you go back to code reviews, right? That every Friday, for example, that's happening at GitHub. Every Friday, they are sharing in some teams. They are sharing, what did I learn in this code review that was really excellent, right? Either it's a comment that I
Yes.
know person really took the time and gave me great comment, or I'm showing some code that I have seen that I haven't seen before, or some paradigm or
Yes.
something that I have seen. So, and we're making some of those very implicit things that are internal, that are not, we are making them explicit and sharing them. And I think this is a celebration, as you said. I think those are things that teams
Yes.
can maybe do to celebrate, um, what's also often referred to as glue work, right? Oh, this
Yeah.
colleague helped me, or that
Yeah.
person, they didn't work on their ticket, which helped them for their promotion, but they actually went out of their way and did this and that, right? And so really openly sharing this and making it explicit, and I think especially in our remote world now, it's more and more
Yeah.
important, right? That we share that
Absolutely.
somehow. Yeah.
No, I think that that's a beautiful point and really really important and something that I also saw, something again that people said in the interviews, which was I want to see specific examples. I want to sit next to somebody and see them code, and that just I think people don't know how much that doesn't happen. I think
Yeah.
that they assume it's happening or they say, "Oh, go get coffee, with this person who wrote the code. You'll go talk to them." But people often struggle, especially if you're remote, if you're a new person, there's all kinds of ways in which people, reasons that people might not ask for help. And as I told you, I started out my career looking at 3 and 5 year olds and in classrooms and when they ask for help. And even when we are 4 and 5 years old, we are looking at the people around us and we're asking, can I ask for help? Can I talk to you about my real learning? So that continues. And
Yeah.
I think the more you see those small messages and those small social moments can just have a huge impact.
Yeah, yeah, and I think team culture and psychological safety and all of that is
Yeah.
so important, and
Yeah.
it's not something that you can just fix by doing three things today, right? It's
Hmm.
something that you can start, but it's a continuous process, and I think this is one of those very rewarding things, and things that pay off but are a little bit invisible, that you have to constantly work on that, right? And that you have to raise the bar and say we are actually allowed to have questions, be wrong,
Yeah.
have this
Yeah.
growth mindset. And I think it's a continuous work in a team. But the teams that manage to do it, they are so much better off than
That's
than other
absolutely right.
teams, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and it is a beautiful part of it. I try to make these problems easier for myself and for other people by saying, who's already doing this, right? Like, how do we give them a stage to do it? Like, who's the person that everybody goes to this person to ask for help, How
Yeah.
do we make sure that they are, instead of being like burdened by this invisible work, they're actually rewarded for all this support that they're doing? Yeah.
Yeah, that's so true. Well, Kat, that actually brings us to the end of this show. As I said,
Mm,
I'm going to bring you back if you have time, so we
I
can
would love that.
continue. We can continue this discussion a little bit more. But is there anything that you want to tell my listeners? Maybe that you think wraps up some of the learnings that would be powerful for them, for the software engineering teams. How can they be
Hmm.
in a better place? What is the one advice that you would give them?
Yeah, great question. What a lovely question to be asked. I think I end the report that I recently released saying learning matters. And I would like to leave with that, which is that, learning matters and measurement matters. Like whenever we measure something, I think, who is this measurement for? And is it bringing us closer to this culture that we want to have, where we feel free and happy and like we're all learning together, which is what we need in order to tackle these huge, complicated problems in the world. We need to get past some of these myths about where brilliance comes from and the myths that we all need to hide, our learning from each other. But that people will only be able to do that if we make the environment around them safe.
Hmm.
So it kind of comes from both sides, from us building the environment as individuals in it, but also from people who are able to kind of say, well, I'm going to do something to make this environment safer. So that's what I would say, learning matters, it pays off. Let's work for it.
Yeah, yeah, that's beautiful. That's really great. So thank you so much, Kat, for being on my show, and I will definitely ping you again and ask you for
Thank
for more
you.
for more of your input. Thank you so much. Okay, have a
It
good
was a
day.
delight.
Bye bye. This was another episode of the Software Engineering Unlocked podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please help me spread the word about the podcast. Send the episode to a friend via email, Twitter, LinkedIn, well, whatever messaging system you use, or give it a positive review on your favorite podcasting platform such as Spotify or iTunes. This would mean really a lot to me. So thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will talk to you in 2 weeks. Bye.